In the quiet centuries after the fall of Rome, Europe felt like a world covered in a soft and endless fog. Roads, once crowded with merchants and soldiers, grew silent. Forests crept closer to abandoned towns. Old stone bridges cracked beneath creeping moss, while forgotten rivers carved new paths for themselves. It was a time when people looked toward the horizon, not with certainty, but with a slow and cautious hope. The ancient rhythms of empire had faded, and in their place rose a world shaped by survival, memory, and the longing for safety. In these early medieval centuries, where fear and faith lived side by side, the idea of the first castles quietly began to form. Imagine standing in a cold morning mist, somewhere in early medieval Europe, perhaps in the 9th century, when kingdoms were fragile and borders were only lines whispered by traveling priests. The hill beneath your feet is damp. The wind carries the scent of pine and the distant smoke of a small village down the slope. It is here, on remote hilltops and jagged ridges, that the first seeds of the medieval castle were planted. At this time, they were not grand stone fortresses. They were simple protections, barely more than wooden fences and earthen mounds. But to the people who lived in that uncertain world, they were promises that danger could be kept outside, at least for a little while. These early fortifications, known as hillforts or strongholds, were built by communities who felt the tremors of instability across the continent. The fall of Rome had left behind a patchwork of small kingdoms, each struggling to defend itself from raids, rival tribes, and the unpredictable storms of human ambition. A single attack could erase a village. A single winter could turn desperation into conflict. And so, on high ground and remote slopes, communities began to carve defenses into the land itself, shaping mounds of earth into circles, digging ditches in sweeping arcs, placing sharpened wooden stakes along ridges where enemies might climb. These early castles were more than wood and soil. They were symbols of gathering strength. Over time, the simple wooden barricades grew into a unique medieval design. The motte, a steep mound of earth, sometimes natural, often painstakingly built, rose like a small artificial hill. At its top stood a wooden tower, a watchful guardian peering across fields and forests. Below the motte lay the bailey, a courtyard enclosed by wooden walls, containing workshops, stables, kitchens, and the heartbeats of daily life. Smoke rose from cook fires. Farmers took refuge during raids. Children ran between wooden posts holding the walls upright. And at night, when danger prowled beyond the fires, the people looked to the tower above them as a beacon of protection. The Matand Bailey was simple, but it transformed medieval life. For the first time, power took shape as a physical structure, a place where authority lived, where decisions were made, where leadership towered above the land. These structures were not just military solutions. They shaped societies. Villages sprang up around them. Roads bent toward them. Trade passed through their gates. They became centers of law, safety, and community. Imagine the soundscape of such a place in the early Middle Ages. The crackle of firewood, the soft clatter of tools repairing a damaged palisade, the low murmur of families sharing meals after sunset. The early castle was alive, not with splendor, but with purpose. Yet the world around these humble structures was shifting. Raiding groups sailed down coasts, striking suddenly with speed and ferocity. Rival nobles fought for land. Kings rose and fell with dizzying frequency. In these storms, the Matand Bailey design spread across Europe, especially in regions that needed quick, reliable defense. But, As the decades passed and threats grew more complex, the people slowly understood that wood, no matter how thick, burned too easily. It splintered under attack. It weathered with time. Thus began a transformation that would shape the next chapter of medieval history, the move from wood to stone. This transition did not happen quickly, nor without sacrifice. Stone was expensive, heavy, and required immense labor. Quarrymen carved blocks from grey cliffs. Oxen pulled wagons across muddy roads. Builders raised walls in slow, careful increments, chipping each block until it fit tightly against the next. It took years, sometimes decades, to raise stone towers that could withstand not only the enemy's fire, but the rain, wind, and centuries themselves. Still, even before stone dominated the landscape, the concept of the castle was growing clearer. It was no longer merely a defensive structure. It was a statement. A castle said, "This land is watched. This community is protected. This power will endure." Early medieval rulers used castles to extend authority. A single fortress on a hill could command entire valleys. Messages traveled faster from tower to tower. Armies could gather more efficiently. A castle became both shield and signal, defense and declaration. And with each new construction, medieval society wove itself deeper into a system of feudal obligations. Lords protected villagers. Villagers provided labor and loyalty, and kings rewarded loyal lords with land from which new castles would rise. But beyond politics, there was a quieter story unfolding, one of families living behind wooden palisades, of soldiers warming their hands before small fires, of farmers who felt safer because a tower cast its shadow across their fields. These early castles were part of daily life. People cooked within their courtyards, prayed in small chapels near the gates, celebrated harvest festivals under the watch of wooden walls, and sought refuge in times of storm. There is something profoundly human in the creation of a fortress. It is an acknowledgement of fear, but also an act of hope. A castle is built not only because danger exists, but because people believe they can endure it. As the early Middle Ages progressed, foggy hillforts turned into defined strongholds. Wooden towers became taller, thicker, more carefully constructed. Communities learned where to place gates to slow enemies, where to build ditches, how to shape walls so arrows could be fired from safety. Slowly, cautiously, the concept of the medieval castle grew into something recognizably structure that stood between chaos and order, between vulnerability and survival. Imagine walking through such a place at dawn. Dew clings to the grass. Smoke rises in thin blue threads from the bailey. Birds settle on the wooden beams, filling the air with their soft calls. A guard slowly descends the ladder from the mott's tower after a long night of watching the horizon. The scent of baking barley bread drifts from a small kitchen hut. Life continues, quietly, rhythmically, beneath the authority of the castle's wooden crown. This was the beginning, not glamorous, not yet iconic, but deeply meaningful. These early fortresses laid the foundation for the magnificent stone castles that would later dominate landscapes, shape kingdoms, and become symbols of an entire age. But before stone and grandeur came wood, earth, fear, and hope, simple materials woven with the determination of people who wanted to protect their homes and their futures. The fog of the early Middle Ages slowly lifted, and with it rose humanity's first true castles, born from necessity, strengthened by belief, and destined to evolve into towering symbols of medieval identity. Sleep now, The next chapter of history awaits. As the Middle Ages moved forward, the world began to shift in slow but certain ways. Wooden towers that once stood bravely on lonely hills creaked with age. Palisades splintered under storms. Villagers whispered of raids growing more frequent and armies growing more organized. The fragile defenses of an earlier century could no longer withstand the ambitions of new lords, new kingdoms, and new threats. It was during this period, somewhere between the 11th and 12th centuries, that Europe experienced a profound transformation, one that would reshape landscapes, societies, and imaginations. Wooden fortresses gave way to stone, and the first great keeps rose like giants into the medieval sky. Imagine approaching a construction site of such a keep in its earliest days. The hilltop has been cleared, the wind carries the scent of freshly cut timber, and the ground trembles beneath the footsteps of workers hauling stone. Quarrymen carve blocks from distant cliffs. Oxen pull carts loaded with grey slabs that gleam faintly in the morning light. Engineers, educated men with precise mind, space the grounds, measuring distances with ropes and wooden rods. Beneath their guidance, stonemasons chip, shape, and lift rocks heavier than any man should be able to move. It is difficult work, slow work, dangerous work, but work that will leave its mark on the world for centuries. Stone keeps did not appear because rulers sought beauty. They appeared because rulers sought permanence. Wood rots, burns, and falls. Stone endures. The first stone keeps were built with thick rectangular walls, sometimes over 10 feet thick, designed to resist fire, battering rams, and determined attackers. These structures were known as great towers or dungeons, and their arrival marked the birth of what many imagine when picturing a medieval castle. Their walls stood tall against wind and time, their corners sharp, their silhouettes unmistakable across valleys and plains. Inside, the rooms were dim but secure. The thick stone walls muffled sound, trapping heat in winter and cool air in summer. Small windows, narrow as arrow slits, let in only thin ribbons of daylight. Torches flickered against the stone, filling the keep with the warm scent of burning pitch. The echo of footsteps on spiral staircases mingled with the soft hum of life cooks preparing meals in lower chambers, servants carrying baskets, guards sharpening swords, children whispering near the hearth, their voices wrapped in the smoky glow of firelight. The keep was the heart of the castle. It was not only a military structure, but a home, a throne, a treasury, and a final refuge. Outside, the world grew increasingly complex. Rival nobles built keeps to strengthen their power. Kings constructed keeps to secure their borders. Stone towers sprouted across Europe like new sentinels rising from the earth. Each tower carried its own story, shaped not only by the stone it was built from, but by the people who lived within its walls. Some keeps were plain and practical, others adorned with carvings and tapestries, but all shared one purpose: survival. The transition from wood to stone was more than a change of material, it was a transformation of identity. A wooden fortress protected, a stone castle ruled. With the rise of stone keeps came the rise of new classes: master mason guilds, engineers, specialists who understood weight distribution and stress points. These men were the architects of the medieval world, shaping not only walls but entire societies. Their talent determined whether a castle would stand for a lifetime or crumble within a decade. Their innovations, such as the use of buttresses, improved mortar, and interlocking stone patterns, in modern engineering. But stone did much more than strengthen walls. It changed warfare itself. Armies adapted. Siege engines grew more powerful. Catapults were redesigned to hurl heavier stones. Battering rams grew larger, covered with roofs to shield soldiers from arrows. The invention of the trebuchet, capable of launching enormous projectiles, arrived in direct response to stone fortification. In a quiet and poetic way, castles and siege weapons danced through history together, each innovation prompting another in an endless struggle of defense and attack. Yet life in a stone keep was not defined solely by war. It was also shaped by ordinary routines. Lords held court in the great hall, seated beneath banners embroidered with symbols of their lineage. Musicians played soft melodies on lutes as feasts began. The smell of roasted meat and spiced wine filled the air. Children played near the long tables, laughing while servants carried platters. Women embroidered tapestries that told the stories of ancestors or battles long past. Priests offered prayers in small chapels lit by candles flickering like tiny stars, despite its cold stone walls. A keep was alive, humming with human stories, for the villagers living beyond the castle walls. The keep was both a protector and a landmark. Its high tower cast a long shadow across the fields. Farmers used it as a point of direction when walking home through early evening mist. Travelers, weary from long journeys, felt comfort at the sight of a keep rising over the horizon like a promise of shelter. In times of danger, villagers fled through the castle gates, gathering in the bailey while guards barred the doors. The keep was strength. The keep was memory. The keep was hope. It was also a demonstration of wealth and authority. A towering stone keep announced to the world, Asterisk here stands a family powerful enough to command labor, land, and loyalty. Asterisk in an age where wealth was measured not by coins, but by land and influence. Stone was the most eloquent language a ruler could speak. Across Europe, famous keeps began to define regions. The White Tower in London, Château de Cousy in France, Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, and countless others. Each keep watched over towns and rivers, guarding trade routes and securing borders. Their shadows stretched across generations, but even as they rose, the earth beneath them remembered the earlier days, the wooden towers, the trembling uncertainties, the quiet fog of the early Middle Ages. The stone keep was the next chapter, written with confidence and ambition. But it grew from foundations shaped by fear and hope. As time passed, stone keeps became more refined. Rounded towers replaced sharp corners to better deflect projectiles. Gatehouses became more complex, featuring portcullises, murder holes, and winding passages. Everything became designed with intention: how to slow attackers, how to trap them, how to protect the heart of the castle. The architecture of survival brought with it a strange beauty, an artistry carved not only into sculptures but into defense itself. The world of stone castles was not simply functional, it was poetic. Imagine the sunset casting gold across a newly built keep, its walls glowing like embers against the sky. Imagine the quiet songs of workers finishing their day. Imagine the lords standing on the battlements, looking over lands that stretched like a rolling tapestry beneath the fading light. The keep was more than a building. It was a story written in stone, and in that story lived countless lives, men who trained for battle, women who managed households with skill and wisdom, children who grew up beneath banners fluttering in the courtyard breeze, travelers who found temporary refuge, craftsmen who carved their skill into every block, and rulers who pondered the fate of their land while standing atop the highest tower. Each keep was a world unto itself, a world of protection, routine, ambition, and dreams built to last beyond lifetimes. As stone towers continued to rise against the sky, Europe entered a new phase in its medieval journey. Castles grew larger, fortifications grew smarter. Life inside the walls became richer, more structured, more connected to the rhythms of feudal society. Stone had become the symbol of authority. But soon, castles would grow beyond simple keeps. Walls would stretch wider. Gatehouses would grow stronger. Communities would cluster around their outer defenses. And the castle, once a simple hilltop fort, would become an intricate universe of structures, people, and stories. The next chapters will explore that growing complexity. But for now, in this moment, imagine a stone keep standing on a windswept hill, its shadow long and steady, its walls glowing faintly in the early dawn. It is not merely rising against the sky, it is rising into history. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. As medieval castles evolved from simple hilltop keeps into formidable stone fortresses, a new kind of intelligence began to shape their growth. Intelligence rooted not in poetry or art, but in the calm, calculated science of survival. The people of the Middle Ages did not have modern engineering degrees, blueprints, or digital models, yet their understanding of defense was profound. They studied the land, they observed enemy tactics, and they listened carefully to the lessons carved into the ruins of fallen strongholds. Little by little, through necessity and imagination, they built walls that were not merely obstacles but masterpieces of strategic design. To understand this transformation, imagine standing at the foot of a great medieval wall. The stones rise far above your head, each one placed with intention. The surface is rough beneath your fingertips, weathered by rain, sun, and centuries of watchful guarding. The top of the wall is lined with battlements' crenellations, shaped like the teeth of a giant, giving archers shelter as they peer down at the world beyond. The air has a faint scent of lichen and stone dust. From this vantage point, you begin to feel the castle's quiet heartbeat. Walls were the first and most important line of defense. But they were not just walls, they were stories of human ingenuity. Early castle walls were simple, straight, and tall. But as siege weapons evolved, walls began to bend and curve. Architects learned that rounded towers could better deflect stones from tribute. Sloping bases offered added strength. Multiple layers of walls created depth and confusion for attackers. The castle became a puzzle, one that an enemy had to solve while under a rain of arrows, stones, and boiling oil. Moats became another crucial component of this defensive landscape. Though often imagined as deep trenches filled with shining water and river-fed currents, many medieval moats were dry, steep, angular ditches nearly impossible to climb under fire. Whether filled with water or not, the moat's purpose was the same: to slow the enemy, to disrupt siege towers, and to force attackers into vulnerable positions. Picture a moat glistening under a grey medieval sky. Ducks glide lazily across it. Reeds sway in the breeze. Beneath its serene surface lies a barrier that could protect hundreds of lives. Even in its quietest moments, a moat was never only water, it was time. Every second an attacker wasted crossing it was a second the defenders used to prepare. Beyond moats and walls, castle designers developed an entire choreography of defense. The main gate, often the most tempting entry point, became a realm of traps and surprises. Drawbridges could be lifted with astonishing speed, leaving invaders stranded. Portcullis's heavy iron grates dropped like thunder, trapping enemies inside narrow passages where defenders could strike from above. Murder holes allowed boiling water, oil, stones, or arrows to rain down from hidden openings. Even the ground beneath attackers' feet was designed to disorient them, with slopes that forced them to move slowly or unevenly. Every movement an intruder made was predicted, every angle considered, yet the genius of castle defense was not limited to stone and wood. Geography played an equally powerful role. Castles were placed on cliffs where the wind howled and climbing was nearly impossible, or on islands where the water formed a natural shield. Others rose above river bends, their reflections trembling in the current. The land itself became part of the fortress, making the castle feel less like a building and more like a living creature rooted into the earth. The defenders, too, played a part in this silent science. Archers trained to use the castle's angles to their advantage. Watchmen paced the battlements with slow, steady steps, their shadows stretching across the walls at dusk. Knights studied techniques for defending gates, protecting ladders, and responding to siege engines. Even the simplest villagers learned where to run, how to shelter, and how to warn others if danger approached. The beauty of medieval defense lay not only in strength but in strategy. A well-built castle did not need constant battles to justify its existence. In fact, many castles never faced a siege, at all a testament to their intimidating presence. The mere sight of a well-fortified stone stronghold could be enough to deter attackers. A castle's height, its glimmering walls, its imposing towers, they spoke a silent language. Approach if you dare. But know we have prepared. This psychological power was perhaps the most underestimated aspect of medieval architecture. Castles were not only shields, they were symbols. They told stories of stability, order, and control. Travelers saw them as landmarks of safety. Merchants viewed them as centers of authority, and enemies regarded them as challenges that required thought, resources, and risk as the centuries passed. Defensive features grew even more intricate. Some castles developed concentric defenses, multiple rings of walls layered one behind the other, each ring stronger than the last. In such designs, attackers could breach an outer wall only to find themselves trapped in a killing ground between layers, exposed to defenders above. Other castles used hidden tunnels, escape routes, or secret chambers where supplies could be stored during a siege. Yet for all their strength, castle defenses were not merely instruments of war. They were reflections of medieval thought and era, shaped by caution, hope, and a desire for permanence. The people who lived behind these walls believed deeply in the power of preparation. They built not only for themselves, but for generations ahead, knowing that one day their children or grandchildren might need the same protection. The castle, in its quiet and calculated design, held the fears and dreams of entire communities. Imagine now, standing atop a fully built wall at twilight. The sky glows, soft orange. A breeze rustles through the banners hanging from nearby towers. Far below, the countryside stretches in peaceful silence, fields, golden with grain, forests dark with the promise of night. Inside the walls, torches flicker to life. Guards change shifts with tired but steady steps. A dog barks in the courtyard. A lone lantern glows in the window of a scribe copying a manuscript. Late into the evening, the castle is still, but it is ready. It is ready for the unknown, ready for the storms of history, ready for the battles that may never come, but cannot be ignored. And beneath its readiness lies something unexpectedly comforting, the assurance that human beings, even in their most uncertain times, strive not only for protection, but for peace. The walls they build, the moats they dig, the gates they reinforce, all are expressions of care. People wanted to protect their families, their harvests, their futures in this way. Medieval defensive architecture becomes more than military planning. It becomes a testament to hope, with each stone laid, with each trench carved, with each tower raised. They whispered, we will survive. We will endure. We will dream again when danger passes. And so the castle grew, not only in height, but in heart, enduring symbol of humanity's resilience. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. Life inside a medieval castle was a world shaped by contrasts, cold stone walls softened by warm fires, strict routines balanced by moments of laughter, and the constant presence of danger woven gently with the rhythms of daily living. Though we often imagine castles as silent, echoing structures filled only with armor and shadow, the truth is far richer. A castle was not just a fortress, it was a living community. A small universe contained within walls of stone and guarded gates. To step inside is to enter a world where survival and comfort intertwined. Beneath the same vaulted ceilings, imagine opening a heavy wooden door and walking into the great hall of a medieval castle. The outside world is cold, perhaps with a winter wind brushing snow across the courtyard. But inside, a wide fire crackles beneath a hooded chimney. Shadows dance across tapestries that hang from the walls, their colors glowing softly in the firelight. Long wooden tables stretch across the room, carved with marks from feasts and gatherings that took place years before. A dog sleeps near the hearth. Servants shuffle quietly as they prepare the evening meal. The hall is the heart of the castle, the place where people gather, share stories, settle disputes, and celebrate life when the world outside feels harsh. The great hall served many roles. During the day, it was a courtroom where the Lord listened to petitions from villagers. It was a council chamber where important matters of land, taxes, and defense were discussed. At night, it was a dining room alive with music, laughter, and the clink of goblets against polished wooden tables. The air often smelled of roasted meat, fresh bread, burning pine logs, and herbs hung from the rafters to dry. Children would run between the benches, smiling as musicians tuned their instruments. Travelers arriving on weary horses found refuge here, sharing stories of distant lands as snow melted from their cloaks. But beyond the warmth of the hall lay the colder, quieter parts of castle life. Narrow corridors ran along the inner walls, their stone floors chilled even in summer. Torches flickered with thin golden flames that cast long shadows on the walls. Spiral staircases wound upward like stone seashells, twisting into towers where guards kept watch through narrow arrow slits. Their breaths fogged the air on winter nights, and their armor grew cold against their skin. Yet even these chilly spaces formed part of the castle's rhythm, steady heartbeat of vigilance dot above the great hall. Private chambers held a different kind of life. These were the lords' and ladies' rooms, often warmer and more carefully decorated than the rest of the castle. Pillows stuffed with feathers sat atop heavy wooden beds. Bright rugs softened the cold stone floors. Windows framed with wooden shutters allowed sunlight to spill inside during the day. These rooms were sanctuaries where letters were written, where families gathered in quiet moments, and where women embroidered tapestries that told stories of myths, battles, and seasons. Not far away lay the solar, a private family room more intimate than the hall below. Here the lord's family might sit together by a smaller fire, sipping warm drinks, discussing matters of estate, reading aloud from manuscripts, or listening to minstrels play soft songs. It was a place where the noise of the castle faded and life felt gentle. Late afternoon sunlight often spilled through the windows, creating golden squares on the floor where children played or cats stretched lazily in the warmth below the ground. However, life took on a very different character. The castle cellar was a world of storage and survival. Barrels of ale and wine lined the walls. Salted meats hung from hooks. Baskets of onions, dried fish, preserved fruits, and hard cheese filled the shelves. Torches burned low here, leaving much of the space in shadow. During winter, the cellar became the castle's lifeline, a place where careful planning ensured that the cold months could be endured. Near the cellar was the bustling kitchen. This was one of the castle's warmest rooms, haven of heat, smoke, and activity. Fires roared beneath iron cauldrons. Pots simmered with stews rich in herbs and vegetables. Servants hurried between tables, kneading dough, chopping roots, and preparing meals for dozens or even hundreds of people. The scent of roasting meat mixed with the earthy smell of fresh bread and the sharp tang of onions. A castle kitchen was both noisy and comforting, full of clattering pans, murmured orders, and the constant hum of purposeful work. Across the courtyard, the stables echoed with soft neighs and the rustle of straw. Horses were essential to castle life, used for travel, messages, farming, and war. Stable hands cared for them tirelessly, brushing their coats, feeding them oats, cleaning their stalls. In winter, the warm breath of the horses created small pockets of mist inside the stable, and the scent of hay added a sweetness to the cold air. Higher still, the towers held the castle guards. Their lives were defined by vigilance. Day and night, they patrolled the walls, watching for distant fires that signaled danger, listening for the sound of approaching horses, scanning the horizon for movement. On quiet nights, the guards heard the rustle of owls sweeping across the battlements and the gentle sigh of wind passing through arrow slits. In these moments, the castle felt like a living creature breathing. Slowly, against the darkness, servants moved through the castle like quiet currents of life. There were chambermaids who cleaned and warmed rooms, cooks who prepared meals, scribes who copied documents by candlelight, blacksmiths who hammered glowing iron into tools and weapons, and stewards who managed the stores. Their work was steady and essential. Without them, the grand halls and towers would have fallen silent. Outside the castle walls, villagers lived simpler lives, but their world was connected to the castle's rhythms. They farmed fields, tended livestock, paid taxes, and sought shelter during danger. Many worked daily inside the castle, bringing grain to the mill, wool to the weaving rooms, or wood to the fires. In return, the castle offered protection, a towering presence that stood between them and the uncertainties of the medieval world. Despite the hardness of castle walls, life inside was not without joy. Festivals filled the courtyard with music. Wedding celebrations spilled into the great hall. Winter feasts lifted spirits during the darkest days of the year. Children played with wooden toys near the gatehouse. Dogs chased each other through the bailey. Cats hunted mice in storerooms. And during quiet evenings, the castle felt like a small, warm village wrapped in stone, glowing from within like a lantern against the night. But life inside the castle was also shaped by responsibility. Lords trained for leadership. Ladies managed households, weaving order into every task. Knights practiced swordplay in the courtyard, their armor clanging in rhythmic patterns. Pages and squires learned discipline, preparing for the day they would take on greater roles. Priests offered prayers in small chapels, filling the air with incense and soft chants. Though medieval castle life was demanding, its routines brought comfort. The ringing of bells signaled meals, curfews, and prayers. The passing of seasons shaped the pace of work. The rising smoke from the great hall's chimney became a daily reassurance that warmth and community waited inside. And so, life inside a medieval castle was a balance between the harshness of stone and the warmth of human presence. It was a world where laughter echoed beneath high ceilings, where footsteps softened the cold floors, and where stories passed from generation to generation under the protection of towers that touched the sky in these walls. People loved, worked, hoped, struggled, and dreamed, leaving behind echoes that still linger in castle ruins today. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. There is a unique silence that settles over a castle when a siege begins, a silence not of peace, but of breath held tight in the chest of an entire community. Outside the walls, an enemy gathers like a storm on the horizon. Inside, life slows, grows tense, and becomes sharpened by the knowledge that days, weeks, or even months of uncertainty lie ahead. To live through a medieval siege was to experience time differently. Each sunrise a reminder of danger, each sunset a quiet victory in survival. In this chapter, imagine standing on the ramparts of a castle at dawn. The sky is pale and cold, touched by the faint blush of morning. Beneath the walls stretches a landscape no longer familiar. What was once farmland and open fields is now dotted with tents, siege engines, gathering soldiers, and campfires that glow like embers in the half-light. Smoke rises in thin lines from the enemy camp. Their voices echo faintly through the morning air. The world outside the walls feels both close and distant. Inside the castle, preparations are underway. The gates are barred. Water barrels are filled. Archers test the tension of their bows. Guards inspect the battlements, ensuring every stone, every arrow slit, every defensive angle is ready. In the kitchens, cooks ration food carefully, calculating how long the supplies might last if the siege drags on. Priests offer prayers for protection, their soft chants drifting through corridors lit by trembling candlelight. Even the children feel the shift in the air, whispering questions to their parents about how long the danger will last. A siege was not just a battle, it was a war of endurance, medieval. Attackers rarely charged directly at stone. Walls, unless desperation forced their hand. Instead, they surrounded a castle, cutting off supplies, waiting for hunger or disease to weaken the defenders. Siege warfare relied as much on patience as on violence. The goal was simple: force surrender without wasting too many lives. But the defenders knew this, and their preparations were equally careful. Food became precious. Bread was baked in smaller loaves. Meat was preserved with extra salt. Vegetables were stored in cool cellars. Every household inside the walls learned to stretch meals, to conserve fuel, to share warmth. Water was guarded like treasure. Wells inside the courtyard became lifelines. Soldiers patrolled constantly, watching for signs that the enemy might attempt to poison the water or block access to it. Time inside a besieged castle felt strange. Days stretched slowly. Nights felt long and uneasy. Yet life continued with quiet determination. Families gathered near fires, telling old stories to distract from the tension outside. Children played softly with wooden toys. Women tended to the wounded or helped prepare supplies. Men sharpened swords, repaired shields, or carried heavy stones to the battlements. Above them all, the walls stood like guardians. From high atop the battlements, the defenders could see siege engines taking shape, wooden towers rising slowly as workers hammered them together, trebuchets being assembled, their long arms stretching backward like the limbs of great wooden beasts, battering rams built beneath protective roofs, ladders sharpened at one end so they could lodge against the castle walls. Watching these preparations could fill the defenders with dread, yet also with a certain grim pride. For every machine the enemy built, the castle had an answer. The defenders used height to their advantage. Archers released arrows from positions where they were nearly impossible to reach in return. Stone throwers used gravity to amplify their strength. Cauldrons filled with boiled water or oil stood ready at the top of the gatehouse. Heavy rocks lined the walkways, prepared to be dropped through murder. Hol's castle was a school of controlled violence, every angle designed to turn the invaders' strength against them. But not every siege turned into a storm of clashing weapons. Sometimes the waiting was worse than any battle. Diseases spread quickly in cramped conditions. Fear whispered through the halls like a draft of cold wind. At night, defenders heard the distant sound of the enemy's hammers, the unsettling silence between footsteps, or the eerie calm of a camp preparing for some unknown move at dawn. Inside the great hall, the castle's lord assumed a role far more important than military. Commander He became the steadying presence that held the community together. Every announcement, every decision, every comforting word mattered. A lord who panicked could unravel the fragile hope of hundreds. A lord who stayed calm could inspire resilience far beyond logic. If the siege dragged on, negotiations sometimes occurred. Messengers, under the protection of temporary truce, would walk between camps, carrying offers or demands. These tense exchanges carried the weight of countless lives. Sometimes, a peaceful surrender was the only way to avoid starvation or unnecessary bloodshed. Other times, the defenders refused to yield, choosing hardship over dishonor. The castle itself also played its own role. Its walls absorbed the force of hurled stones. Its towers provided vantage points. Its gatehouse became a test of engineering strength. Even the layout of its inner walls could slow attackers should they breach the outer defenses. Consider for a moment the emotional landscape inside a besieged castle. The fear of running out of food, the worry for loved ones, the sleepless nights filled with the sound of distant enemy laughter or the creaking of siege engines. Yet, alongside the fear lived an immense determination of belief that as long as the walls remained standing, hope remained alive. Sieges often ended not with dramatic battles, but with exhaustion. Sometimes the attackers gave up, having wasted too much time and resources. Sometimes reinforcements arrived for the defenders, breaking the enemy's confidence. And yes, sometimes hunger forced a surrender that no number of arrows could prevent. But every siege left its mark on the castle, and on the people who lived within it. Burn marks on the walls, dented shields stored as reminders, stories passed from one generation to the next about the quiet courage of their ancestors. Even the smallest child raised within those walls would forever remember the tension and the strength that defined the siege. When peace finally returned, life slowly blossomed again. Gates opened cautiously. Merchants brought fresh supplies. Villagers returned to their fields, grateful for soil untouched by battle. The castle, though perhaps scarred, stood proud, a testament to resilience. And when night fell, with danger gone and stars glittering above the towers, the castle breathed with renewed warmth. Fires burned brightly again. Music returned to the hall. Children played freely in the courtyard. Guards shared stories beneath the moonlight. And for a while, the community felt safe again, wrapped in stone and relief. In the centuries that followed, sieges would continue to shape the evolution of castles. New defenses would rise. New strategies would emerge. But the core experience of fear met with courage, of isolation met with unity, of danger met with determination remained unchanged. A siege was never merely a military event. It was a human experience written into the stone of every castle that survived one. And even now, when travelers explore ruined castles on distant hillsides, they can feel the echoes of those long, tense days when survival depended on walls, willpower, and unwavering hope. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. When people think of medieval castles, their minds often wander first to the knights' gleaming figures in armor, mounted on powerful horses, their silhouettes outlined by the rising sun. Knights were the living symbols of the castle's strength, protectors trained not only in battle but in loyalty, discipline, and honor. Yet the path to becoming a knight was far more complex than the shining legends suggest. It was a journey shaped by years of training, sacrifice, bruises, patience, and a deep understanding of duty. And within the castle walls, the echo of this training formed a rhythm that shaped daily life. Imagine stepping into a castle courtyard at dawn. The air is chilly, touched by the soft lavender light of early morning. A thin mist clings to the grass. In the center of the yard, you hear the heavy thud of wooden swords striking against shields. Young boys, barely old enough to lift a helm, practice under the steady gaze of older squires. Their breaths form small clouds in the cold air as they swing, block, stumble, and rise again. This courtyard is not simply a place for exercise, it is the birthplace of the next generation of defenders. Becoming a knight began in childhood. At around 7 years old, a boy of noble birth was sent to another lord's castle to serve as a page. His earliest lessons were not in battle but in courtesy. He learned to be polite, to serve meals, to carry messages, and to assist the lady of the castle. These early tasks taught humility and discipline, foundations far more important than swordsmanship. He also learned the basics of reading, writing, poetry, and music. A knight was expected to be more than a warrior. He had to understand diplomacy, faith, and the traditions of the land he served. Pages played games that secretly trained their bodies, running, jousting with wooden sticks, wrestling on soft straw mats. Every moment of their daily routine, though seemingly simple, prepared them for a life in armor. As they grew older, usually around 14, pages became squires. Their duties became more demanding. A squire tended to a knight's armor and horses, polished weapons until they shone, and followed his mentor into battle not as a fighter, but as an assistant ready to carry supplies, messages, or injured comrades. For the first time, the squire felt the nearness of danger. He heard the clash of weapons, the roar of war horses, and the cries of men charging into uncertain futures. He learned to remain steady even when fear trembled beneath his skin. Training grew harsher. Under the watchful eye of masters-at-arms, squires practiced with blunted swords, spears, and axes. Wooden targets lined the yard. Straw dummies bore the marks of thousands of blows, shields dented and splintered under repeated strikes. Each lesson was a blend of technique and resilience. Squires trained until their muscles ached, until sweat stung their eyes, until their bodies learned the language of combat by instinct alone. But despite the hardships, moments of joy and pride filled their days. There were friendly competitions between squires who could mount a horse fastest, who could strike a target with the greatest precision, who had the best control over their breathing during long bouts of sparring. These contests formed bonds of friendship, camaraderie, and respect that would last a lifetime. The most iconic symbol of knighthood was, of course, the armor. To see a knight fully armored for the first time was to witness a transformation. A man became something larger, something almost mythical. But armor did not begin with gleaming steel claws and curved breastplates. In the early medieval period, armor was simple padded tunics, leather vests reinforced with metal rings, and chainmail painstakingly forged link by link. Each ring was riveted by hand, hundreds of thousands of them forming a garment that shimmered like woven metal. Wearing chainmail was no small feat. It weighed heavily on the shoulders, pulled at the muscles of the back, and grew scorching in summer heat. But it offered unmatched protection. When sunlight touched it, chainmail glimmered like frost across a field. When rain fell upon it, it sang softly with metallic whispers. As centuries passed, armor became more sophisticated. Plates of steel slowly replaced chainmail on arms, legs, and the torso. Artisans hammered raw metal into shapes that fit the human body, creating suits that felt almost like a second skin. Knights learned how to move with surprising grace, even while carrying the weight of their armor. Their silhouettes became symbols of strength and endurance, inspiring both awe and fear. The horses of knights, known as destriers, were equally important. These were powerful animals, bred for strength, agility, and courage. A knight trained for years to bond with his horse, learning to guide it with subtle commands of the knees or shifting of weight. The horse responded not just to reins, but to trust. On the battlefield, a knight and his destrier moved as one body, one breath, one will. Jousting, the most famous spectacle associated with knights, was both entertainment and training. On festival days, colorful banners fluttered across the castle courtyard. Trumpets blared. Crowds gathered, their cheers filling the air like music. Two knights thundered toward each other with lances poised, aiming for the precise moment of impact that would unseat their opponent. But beneath the showmanship lay essential skills balance, timing, courage, and control. Knighthood was not merely a profession, it was a code of life. Knights followed the code of chivalry, a set of ideals that encouraged bravery, loyalty, generosity, protection of the weak, and respect for women. Not all knights lived up to this ideal, for humans are imperfect. But the code offered a guiding star, a dream of moral strength that shaped the stories passed down through generations. Inside castles, knights were indispensable. They guarded the walls at night. They trained squires during the day. They advised their lord, led patrols across nearby lands, and served as symbols of stability. Their presence brought reassurance to villagers who looked to them as protectors. Even their armor, displayed when not in use, reminded all who entered the castle that strength lived within its walls. But knights also lived, personal lives filled with quiet moments that softened their martial image. After long training sessions, they gathered near the fire in the great hall, sharing bread, laughter, and tales of past battles. Some played music, others wrote poetry, and some simply listened as storytellers wove scenes of dragons, lost kings, impossible quests, and timeless love. In these peaceful evenings, even the hardest warrior felt the comfort of belonging. A knight's journey was rarely easy. Many suffered injuries. Some never returned from war. Others carried the weight of responsibility for lands and families. Yet, when viewed from the calm distance of history, the life of a knight appears like a path of transformation, a journey from uncertain boyhood to disciplined adulthood, shaped by effort and illuminated by courage. Training yards echoed with countless footsteps across centuries. Wooden swords splintered, shields cracked, targets wore down. Horses galloped in circles until dust rose into the warm air. And through it all, the castle watched silently, absorbing the sounds of practice and dreams. Even today, when visitors wander through the ruins of medieval castles, they can almost hear faint echoes, the clash of metal, the laughter of squires, the stern voice of a master-at-arms correcting a posture, the snort of a warhorse pawing the ground. These echoes are reminders that castles were never just buildings, they were worlds. And knights were among their brightest spirits. Knights were the living embers of the medieval story, glowing with the heat of duty. Adventure, sacrifice, and honor. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. There is a different kind of quiet inside the sacred spaces of a medieval castle. Quiet not born from fear or war, but from devotion. While many imagine castles only as places of armor and strategy, they were equally places of prayer. The Middle Ages were an era when faith shaped the rhythm of life, and where stone walls sheltered not only soldiers, but also monks, chaplains, relics, and whispered hopes carried across generations. Within these walls, spirituality lived side by side with strength, forming a balance that made medieval life feel anchored to something eternal. Imagine walking through a castle just as dawn breaks. The air is cool and pale, carrying the faint scent of dew on stone. A soft bell rings from a small tower near the chapel, a low, calming sound that echoes across the courtyard. Guards pause mid-stride. Servants bow their heads for a brief moment. Even horses in the stables lift their ears as if listening. The bell calls not to battle, but to prayer. It marks the beginning of a day shaped by ritual, rhythm, and remembrance. In the heart of many castles stood a chapel, often small but beautifully crafted. Sunlight streamed through narrow stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the stone floor. Candles flickered along the altar. The scent of incense drifted lazily through the air, carrying warmth into the cold spaces of the castle. This sacred room became a sanctuary for all who lived within the walls. Lords, ladies, soldiers, servants, children, and weary travelers. Chaplains served as spiritual guides, offering prayers during troubled times and blessings before battles. Their presence brought a sense of peace to a place where uncertainty often lingered. The role of a chaplain went beyond leading services. He comforted the grieving, baptized infants, recorded marriages, and reminded warriors that their actions had consequences not only on earth but in the eyes of God. Yet, not every castle chapel was simple. Some, especially in larger fortresses, held relics, objects believed to carry the essence or history of saints. These relics gave the castle a deeper meaning, transforming it from a mere stronghold into a sacred refuge. People traveled long distances to pray before these relics, hoping for protection, healing, or guidance. Knights swore oaths before them. Lords made decisions in their presence. And during times of siege, the chapel often became the emotional heart of the community, a place where fear found comfort. But faith in the medieval world extended beyond chapels. High on remote hills, in forests wrapped in mist, or along ancient riverbanks, stood monasteries, quiet fortresses of prayer. Some were protected by castle walls, others by natural cliffs, but all stood as symbols of spiritual endurance. Monks worked the land, copied sacred texts, brewed ale, grew herbs for healing, and devoted long hours to silent meditation. Their days moved like gentle waves, prayer, work, reflection, rest. When nearby castles faced danger, monasteries became safe havens. Their thick stone walls, though built for contemplation rather than war, shielded villagers and travelers during sudden raids. In return, knights often protected these holy sites, knowing they were safeguarding not just buildings but the very faith that shaped their world. Some castles were even built around monasteries, forming hybrid fortresses where spiritual and military life blended seamlessly. In such places, the rhythm of chanting monks mingled with the sound of armor clinking in the courtyard. The glow of candlelight merged with torchlight along the walls. It was a world where prayer strengthened resolve and courage drew. Strength from belief. Faith also shaped the daily life of the castle. Important moments, harvests, victories, weddings, the birth of a child, were celebrated with blessings. Feasts began with prayers of gratitude. Even simple meals eaten by servants in the kitchen were often accompanied by a quiet moment of reflection. Faith gave medieval people a sense of structure, meaning, and hope, especially when life outside the walls felt unpredictable. During times of war, knights carried religious symbols into battle crosses sewn into their cloaks, pendants worn against their hearts, or small relics tucked inside their armor. Before riding out, they knelt in the chapel, heads bowed, asking for protection. The thought of divine favor strengthened their resolve, reminding them that they were part of a story larger than themselves. And during sieges, when fear tightened its grip, the chapel was filled with trembling yet determined prayers. Families gathered beneath the high arches, holding hands, whispering hopes that their walls would hold and that dawn would bring safety. The soft chanting of monks echoed through the corridors, calming anxious hearts. Even hardened warriors found solace in these sacred spaces, where the sound of their armor seemed quieter, gentler somehow, as if softened by faith. Some castles even became centers of pilgrimage. Travelers carrying walking staffs and wearing dusty cloaks approached the castle gates with reverence. They came not for shelter or trade, but to see the relics, to pray in the chapel, or to seek the wisdom of the monks. The castle, usually seen as a symbol of power, became instead a place of healing, reflection, and humility. Faith also influenced the architecture of castles. Chapels were often placed where morning sunlight would illuminate the altar. An intentional design meant to connect daily worship with the rising of the sun. Carvings of angels and saints appeared on doorways. Small crosses were etched into the stone of archways. Even the high ceilings of great halls, shaped like the inside of a ship, carried spiritual symbolism, reminding people that they were all passengers on a journey guided by a higher force. But faith inside a castle was not always solemn. During festivals, the castle courtyard came alive with music, dancing, and joyous celebration. Feast days honoring saints were eagerly anticipated, offering breaks from the hardships of daily life. Children ran through the halls wearing garlands of flowers. Bakers prepared sweetbreads, Bells rang in celebration rather than warning, and for a day or two, the burdens of the medieval world felt lighter at night. When torches dimmed and the castle grew quiet, monks continued their prayers in the chapel. Their soft voices echoed through the corridors like gentle waves, reminding everyone, even those asleep in cold chambers, that they were watched over. The sound of night prayers carried a feeling of safety, like a lullaby woven from devotion and peace. In this way, medieval castles were more than instruments of war. They were spiritual sanctuaries, places where human beings could feel close to the divine. Their walls protected bodies, but their chapels protected hearts, and long after battles faded, long after the clang of swords and the gallop of horses became distant memories, the spiritual essence of these castles remained. Even today, when visitors step into the ruins of ancient chapels, they often feel a hush settle around them, a soft invitation to breathe deeply, to reflect, to listen to the invisible threads of history, for in those quiet stones lives the memory of candles flickering against the dark, of prayers rising like smoke, of monks walking slowly beneath archways, and of a world that found comfort in faith when the future felt uncertain. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. A medieval castle was more than stone and strategy. It was a stage where power unfolded. A world of velvet whispers, glittering feasts, quiet alliances, and decisions that shaped the fate of entire kingdoms. Behind the thick walls and guarded gates lived not only soldiers and servants, but also kings, queens, princes, princesses, noble families, and their courts. Their lives created a second universe inside the castle, one filled with ceremony, etiquette, rivalry, ambition, and moments of breathtaking beauty. To walk through such a castle was to witness the pulse of medieval authority, wrapped in layers of tradition and human longing. Imagine entering the great hall on the evening of a royal gathering. Torches glow along the stone walls, their flames casting soft waves of gold across the tapestries. Musicians play gentle melodies from the gallery above, harps, flutes, viols blending into a warm embrace of sound. Servants move silently between long tables, carrying pitchers of spiced wine, loaves of fresh bread, platters of roasted meat, dishes made from herbs gathered in the castle gardens. The scent of honey and wood smoke lingers in the air. At the far end of the hall, beneath a canopy embroidered with royal symbols, sits the noble family. A king, wrapped in a cloak trimmed with fur, listens carefully to a visiting diplomat. His expression is calm, thoughtful, trained over years to reveal little. Beside him, the queen sits with gentle poise, her hands folded gracefully, her eyes observing the hall with quiet intelligence. Their presence alone gives the room a sense of order, a center of gravity that everyone else carefully orbits. Yet royal life inside a castle was neither simple nor endlessly grand. Beneath the polished surface lay constant negotiation. Lords offered loyalty but expected land or favor in return. Knights sought recognition for their service. Merchants presented gifts, hoping for trade privileges. Diplomats arrived carrying messages rolled into parchment, sealed with wax, each one capable of altering alliances or sparking wars. Every smile, every word spoken in the royal court carried weight. But amidst the politics, there was also beauty. Queens often took great interest in the cultural life of the castle. They decorated chambers with fine tapestries depicting scenes from mythology or scripture. They oversaw musicians, poets, and artists who traveled from far regions to entertain and seek patronage. Their chambers smelled of lavender and rosewater, warmed by small fires that softened the chill of stone. In the quiet moments of morning, the queen might sit by a window, sunlight spilling across her embroidery frame, stitching images of hunts, gardens, or religious scenes into fabric that would outlast lifetimes. Princes and princesses grew up between two worlds, one of privilege and one of expectation. Tutors taught them languages, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and diplomacy. Knights trained them in riding and self-defense. Priests guided them in faith. From early childhood, they were taught that every decision they made might one day affect thousands. Their playtime in the gardens or courtyards was balanced with lessons in restraint, leadership, and courtesy. Even their friendships carried political significance. Yet despite this weight, there were tender moments. A young prince might race with his friends along the inner walls, laughter echoing between towers. A princess might feed crumbs to birds in the courtyard fountain, her hair catching the evening sunlight. During feasts, royal children sometimes hid behind pillars or climbed onto benches to watch jugglers and musicians. For all the expectations placed on them, they were still children, discovering the small joys of life inside stone walls. In the upper chambers of the castle, the royal council assembled regularly. Here, kings and trusted advisors discussed taxes, borders, disputes between nobles, rebellions, alliances, or threats of war. Maps spread across wooden tables. Wax seals were broken. Scribes recorded decisions by candlelight. The fate of entire regions often depended on conversations held in these private rooms, where the world outside narrowed into a few decisive voices. Courtiers played a significant role in castle life. They were nobles of varying ranks who lived within the castle or visited frequently, hoping for influence or favor. Their presence created a lively environment filled with conversation, elegance, and subtle competition. Courtiers practiced refined manners, dressed in fine garments dyed with costly pigments, and moved through the castle with an air of confidence. Some brought humor and entertainment. Others brought ambition sharp enough to cut. All were part of the delicate ecosystem that breathed around the throne. Feasts were the grandest moments in royal castles. They celebrated coronations, victories, marriages, births, and religious festivals. During these nights, the castle transformed into a world of glittering light. Tables sagged under the weight of dishes game birds roasted with herbs, pies filled with spiced fruit, bowls of nuts and berries, wheels of cheese, honey cakes, and goblets rimmed with silver. Minstrels told stories of ancient heroes. Dancers spun in embroidered gowns. Acrobats flipped through the air to the sound of delighted gasps. And at the center of it all, the royal family watched with pride and dignity, their presence adding a sense of magic to the night. But life in royal courts was not always joyful. Rivalries simmered beneath smiles. Ambitions clashed behind polite greetings. Rumors drifted through corridors like invisible guests. A whispered sentence could shift the balance of power. A single misstep during a negotiation could change the course of history. And outside the castle walls, common people prayed that their rulers would make wise decisions. For their lives were shaped by choices made far above them, even within the castle. The king or queen was not isolated from hardship. Illnesses struck without mercy. Difficult winters strained supplies. Conflicts with neighboring kingdoms weighed heavily on their shoulders. Moments of private sorrow unfolded behind closed doors. Fear, regret, or the heavy loneliness that sometimes comes with leadership. But the castle continued to function, its routine steady and unbreaking. offering support even in times of personal struggle. There were also moments of profound symbolism in royal castles. Coronations transformed great halls into sacred spaces where power passed from one generation to the next. Weddings filled the courtyard with flowers, music, and hope for peaceful alliances. When a new heir was born, bells rang from the towers, echoing across fields and villages, announcing a future that would one day unfold within those very walls. And in quiet nights, when storms rolled across the sky, kings and queens often found themselves awake near the window, listening to the rain striking stone, thinking of the many lives depending on their guidance. The castle around them felt immense and eternal, yet the weight of their role made them feel achingly human. They knew that one day their names would fade into history, but the stone walls would remain witnesses to all they had built, all they had endured. Life in the royal court was thus a world of balance, strength and vulnerability, power and responsibility, ceremony and humanity. The castle served as both shield and symbol, protecting royalty while reminding them that their duty extended beyond its gates. Even today, when visitors wander through the remains of royal apartments, chambers softened by sunlight, halls shaped by centuries of footsteps, they can sense the echoes of kings and queens who once stood where they now stand. The faint rustle of a silk gown, the murmur of a quiet promise, the distant echo of a crown being placed on a bowed head. For the story of medieval royalty is not only a story of rule and decision, it is a story of people living within the embrace of stone, trying to lead, to protect, to dream, and to find meaning in a world where every choice left a mark on history. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. For centuries, medieval castles stood like immovable guardians over valleys, rivers, and kingdoms. Their towers reached toward the sky, their walls glowed under the morning sun, and their silhouettes carved themselves into the memory of generations. But history, like the shifting wind, never stands still. The world outside the castle walls began to change. New ideas stirred. New dangers emerged. And among the most transformative of these changes was an invention that no stone wall, no matter how thick, could ignore: gunpowder. Imagine living in a time when the sound of war was defined by the clash of swords, the thrum of bowstrings, the crack of shields splintering under blows. Battles echoed with the rhythm of metal against metal. Castles were built around this understanding: a world where strength meant resisting force, where thicker walls meant greater safety. But then, across continents, whispers began to spread of a black powder that could explode with unimaginable power. A powder that could turn a small spark into a force capable of shaking the earth itself. At first, cannons were crude and unreliable. Early versions were small, made of iron or bronze, and sometimes more dangerous to the soldiers firing them than to the walls they aimed to destroy. They misfired, they overheated, they cracked. But as the years passed, metallurgists improved their craft. Cannon makers learned how to shape the barrels more precisely, how to mix gunpowder more consistently, how to create cannonballs strong enough to withstand immense pressure. The world began to shift the moment cannons became reliable. Picture a castle that has stood for 200 years, thick walls weathered by storms, towers rising proudly, banners fluttering in the wind. Now imagine the first cannonball striking its outer wall. The sound is unlike anything the castle has heard before. Not the sharp ring of metal, not the heavy thud of a battering ram. It is a deep, roaring cracker sound that shakes dust from the rafters and sends vibrations through the ground. The stone splinters, the wall shudders. In that moment, defenders realize that their ancient refuge faces a new enemy, one that does not climb ladders or hack at gates, but simply breaks through everything once believed unbreakable. Gunpowder did not just damage castles, it redefined warfare. Sieges changed dramatically. Instead of building massive siege towers or tunneling beneath walls, attackers rolled cannons into position, surrounded by crews who worked with practiced precision. Soldiers lit fuses, stepped back, and watched as each thunderous blast carved cracks into the stone. Week-long sieges could now end in days. A castle could fall not from starvation or negotiation, but from sheer explosive force. And yet, defenders did not surrender without adapting. Castle designers experimented with new shapes and techniques. Walls were rebuilt to be lower but thicker, angled to deflect cannon fire rather than simply absorb it. Earthen ramparts replaced towering stone battlements, as compacted soil could cushion the shock of cannonballs better than brittle rock. Star-shaped fortresses emerged across Europe's structures with pointed bastions, designed to cover every approach with intersecting lines of fire. These new designs marked the beginning of the bastion fort, a symbol of the shift from medieval to early modern warfare. But even with these innovations, the age of the traditional medieval castle was slowly slipping away, like a sunset fading behind distant hills. Inside the castles, people began to notice the change. Knights still trained in the courtyard, but their armor grew less useful. Heavy plate that once protected them against arrows and sword strikes offered little defense against bullets. The romantic image of the armored knight on horseback dimmed as firearms spread across the battlefield. Soldiers now carried muskets, pistols, and handheld explosives. Warfare grew louder, smokier, and more chaotic. Daily life inside the castle quieted in new ways. The great halls that once rang with feasts and celebrations felt different as the world moved forward. Royal families began to build palace structures focused not on defense but on comfort and elegance. Courtiers favored grand staircases, wide windows, and intricate gardens over stone walls and arrow slits. Wealth and power shifted away from fortified heights to cities, trade centers, and cultural hubs. Some castles remained in use as prisons or administrative centers. Others became storage sites, military outposts, or symbols preserved for ceremony rather than war. But many were abandoned. Without constant maintenance, ivy crept along their walls. Roofs collapsed. Wooden beams rotted. Birds made nests in windows once framed with stained glass. What was once the beating heart of a community became a quiet remnant of another age. Yet even in their decline, castles held a strange kind of beauty. Travelers walking through valleys would see their silhouettes. On hilltops, broken towers softened by moss and rain. Walls interrupted by wildflowers growing between cracks. These ruins were not empty. They carried memories. They whispered stories. They held the breath of centuries within their stones. A fallen tower was not only a sign of destruction, it was a witness to the passage of time. As cannons roared louder across history, castles responded with silence, allowing the world to change around them. And though their military purpose faded, their symbolic power grew stronger. Artists painted them as romantic ruins. Poets wrote verses about lost ages and noble warriors. Scholars studied their architecture with admiration, and ordinary people visited them to touch their walls, to feel the texture of time beneath their fingertips. Some castles found new life as homes for nobility, who valued heritage more than strategy. They built gardens where soldiers once marched, placed furniture in rooms formerly filled with armor, hosted gatherings where war councils once met. Other castles were preserved by states and transformed into museums. Children walked through their corridors with wide eyes, imagining knights, banners, and feasts in this way. The story of castles did not end it transformed. Gunpowder may have broken their military strength, but it could not break their place in the human imagination. Even now, when someone sees a castle rising above a hill, a sense of wonder awakens. Castles remind us of courage, legacy, love, sacrifice, and the persistence of belief in difficult times. They remind us that humans once built things not merely for utility, but for protection, pride, and community. The slow crumble of castles was not a moment of defeat. It was a quiet transition from one chapter of history to another, and in their steady decline, they became something deeper, symbols of endurance, memory, and the graceful acceptance of change. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. To stand before the ruins of a medieval castle is to stand at the edge of time itself. The world around you may be modern cars on distant roads, cities lit with electricity, voices carried by phones and screens, but the castle remains untouched by these changes. Weathered stones rise quietly into the air, softened by moss and the steady touch of wind. Broken towers point toward the sky like the memories of a forgotten age. Arched windows, once filled with stained glass and flickering candlelight, open now to the vastness of the horizon. And in the silence of these ruins, one begins to understand the true legacy of medieval castles, not just as structures, but as symbols of human endurance, imagination, and the passage of centuries. Imagine walking through a ruined castle at dusk. The last light of day settles gently on the walls, painting them in shades of gold and amber. Grass sways between the fallen stones. The distant call of an evening bird echoes softly across the courtyard. Your footsteps crunch against the gravel path as you move beneath archways touched by the fingerprints of time. The air feels cool, almost sacred, carrying the faint scent of earth and history. In this quiet moment, the castle feels alive, again not with people, but with memory. But where a great hall once bustled with feasts and celebrations, wildflowers now grow. Their petals flutter in the breeze, delicate reminders of how life continues even after the mightiest structures crumble. Where knights once trained with wooden swords, their laughter bouncing between the walls, shadows now stretch long across the ground. Where royalty once sat in council discussing the fate of kingdoms, only soft sunlight filters through broken shutters. The castle has changed, yet it has not disappeared. Instead, it has transformed into a storyteller. Every fallen stone is a page. Every crumbling tower is a chapter, and every visitor becomes a listener. It is easy to imagine the voices that once filled these spaces, the echo of boots on the stairs as guards changed shifts, the soft chanting of monks drifting through the chapel, the clatter of pots in the kitchen as servants prepared meals, the murmured conversations of courtiers sharing secrets beneath torchlight, the laughter of children chasing each other across the bailey. These sounds linger like faint echoes woven into the air. Though centuries have passed, the castle remembers. Ruins have a way of inviting reflection. They remind us that all things, nations, armies, kings, ideas rise and fall. The strongest walls cannot stop the march of time. But they also remind us of something just as important. That beauty does not vanish simply because something is no longer whole. In the broken archways, in the uneven stones warmed by the sun, in the quiet corners filled with moss and birdsong, the castle offers a new kind of beauty, one shaped not by strength, but by endurance. Night, the ruin transforms once more. The sky above fills with stars, each one shimmering like a memory from long ago. Moonlight pours through the empty windows, illuminating patches of wall with gentle silver. The castle becomes a silhouette, dark, majestic, and peaceful. The world around it seems to fade, leaving only the whisper of wind moving through cracks and crevices. The night does not make the castle feel abandoned. Instead, it wraps it in a quiet dignity, as though protecting its stories for yet another generation. Under these stars, it becomes easier to understand why castles still capture the imagination of millions. They stand at the intersection of fantasy and reality. They remind us of knights who rode with courage, of battles fought in desperation, of celebrations that filled halls with light. They remind us of kings and queens who struggled with choices, of monks who prayed for peace, of builders who shaped stone with their bare hands. Castles hold the memories of love, loss, hope, duty, war, faith, ambition, and dreams, everything that makes us human. The legacy of medieval castles extends far beyond their walls. They influenced literature, inspiring tales of noble heroes and enchanted fortresses. They shaped art, appearing in paintings, tapestries, and illuminated manuscripts. They guided the development of architecture, teaching engineers how to use stone, angles, gravity, and space in new ways. They molded the identity of entire regions, becoming landmarks that defined the landscape even long after their military purpose faded. But their deepest legacy lies in the way they connect us to the past. When you place your hand on an ancient castle wall, you touch something built by human hands many centuries ago. You feel the roughness of stone shaped by craftsmen whose names have been forgotten but whose work remains. You sense the weight of history pressing gently beneath your fingertips. You realize that people long before you stood in this same spot, breathed this same air, faced fears and hopes not so different from your own. The castle becomes a bridge, a reminder that human life is a long, continuous thread woven across ages. Yet, despite their grandeur, medieval castles teach us humility. They remind us that even the strongest walls eventually crumble, that nothing endures unchanged. And still, they show us that meaning can survive even after structure fades. A broken tower still inspires awe. A ruined hall still holds echoes of laughter. A moss-covered archway still invites imagination. What remains is not weakness, but memory. Many castles today are preserved as historical treasures. Volunteers repair stonework. Historians document their stories. Artists sketch their outlines. Children visit on school trips, their eyes wide with wonder. Tourists wander through courtyards with cameras and notebooks. These ruins continue to teach, to enchant, to welcome all who seek them. They are reminders of where humanity has been, on gentle invitations to consider where it may go. To sleep near such ruins, even in imagination, is to rest with centuries of wisdom. The earth feels steady beneath you. The stars above feel ancient and comforting. The breeze that brushes your face feels like the same wind that whispered through battlements hundreds of years ago. Time slows. The mind softens. The heart opens, and as the night deepens, the castle becomes more than stone. It becomes a companion, steady, patient, and timeless. A presence that watches over valleys and rivers long after kingdoms have risen and fallen. A monument to the resilience of human hope. For the story of medieval castles is not just the story of fortress walls and battles, it is the story of humanity building, dreaming, protecting, and enduring. It is the story of communities who wanted safety, lands that needed guardians, people who longed to belong to something stronger than themselves. Castles were not just fortresses. They were homes, symbols, and memories that have crossed the boundaries of time and now. As this journey through their history comes to its gentle close, the ruins beneath the stars seem to whisper a final message that nothing built with purpose ever truly disappears. It lives on in the earth, in the stories we tell, and in the hearts that remember. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits.